just talk briefly about activism in the context of the marriage equality campaign. And then I think afterwards we'll go into a bit of a question and answer session, which Angelus will look after. When I would like to think that the marriage equality campaign has been successful so far, and I look at landmarks such as every single Labor conference that has voted on marriage equality, voting in favour of it, the Labor Party changing their platform, the Tasmanian Parliament and the ACT Parliament passing motions in support of marriage equality, hopefully the New South Wales Upper House doing the same, the admission from the Prime Minister 2 weeks ago that marriage equality was inevitable, and the strong community support that there is out there. So I think although we're not there exactly yet, and we've still got obviously a vote in federal parliament, we certainly are progressing really well. And I look at why that's happening, and it is not happening because politicians are out there all engaging on it and moving forward. It's because the community, I think this is just glitching for mine. It's because the community has been taking action in so many different ways. So I look at all the different parts of activism that you can do. So from big rallies and protests through to meetings with MPs, public awareness campaigns and forums, interacting in a private and public way with politicians and decision makers, strong presence in online activism and interaction with the media, so strong government as well as media relations campaigns. We've been able to cover the board, and it's been a combination of groups like mine, of Community Action Against Homophobia, of Equal Love, of the Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby, of Rainbow Labour, of Mardi Gras, and a whole bunch of other organisations that have come together and have worked fairly well together to deliver this. And I think we've seen that there's not just one type of activism that works well, but it's when you have complementary types of activism all working together that you get a very strong result. And it's important that we continue to do that. So I've been very proud to play a part in the campaign and to work with a lot of great people to get us to where we are. And it's given me lots of hope and optimism that we'll get there further. And it's just something, we just have to also make sure we count our victories. Although we haven't got marriage equality in Australia today, we're certainly a lot further ahead today than we are 6 months ago or 12 months ago, and that's because of all these types of activism working together really, really well. We are going to face a very difficult time going forward. A parliamentary vote is a difficult thing to get through, but I'm confident that with the commitment of people within all major parties, with the strong community support behind it, that we will indeed get there. I would like to see it within the next 12 to 18 months, and we'll do everything I can to make sure that happens, but who knows? It is something that we will win, and hopefully sooner than later. So Angelus, did you want to take questions at the end? Or okay, cool. All right. Thank you, everyone, and I'll come back up for any questions a bit later on.
I'd like to next invite Morgan Carpenter up, so Director of Organisation Intersex International Australia.
Thank you. Hi, thanks for staying to hear us speak this afternoon. So I'm here talking for OII Australia, which is the only broad-based support organisation and activist organisation for intersex people in Australia. Intersex people regardless of their particular intersex variation. I thought I maybe should say a few words about why intersex is part of the LGBTI community or movement. I guess personally I don't like calling it a community. I think to me it's a whole series of different overlapping communities of different people with different interests. So anyway, I thought I might address that issue about why we're here and what we have to say. So just in case you don't know, intersex is it's where a person's biological sex is not clearly male or female. It's got nothing to do with androgyny, as you can probably tell by looking at me. But a person might have some characteristics of both sexes or of neither, and it's always congenital. Someone can find out they're intersex at birth, at puberty, when trying to conceive a child, or just by chance, by random chance. It's not an identity, unlike the LGBTI parts of the movement. It's actually an experience of the body, primarily. It's often carved into our bodies. So what's it got to do then with LGBT? I thought by giving you a couple of stories of heterosexuality and intersex, maybe that'll help to illuminate it for you. There's a woman called Hannah Blank, who's a fat activist and a writer of a new history of heterosexuality called Straight, who was recently interviewed in Salon magazine online. It reports, while Blank looks like a feminine woman, her partner is extremely androgynous, with little to no facial hair and a fine, smooth complexion. Hannah's partner is neither fully male nor fully female. He was born with an unconventional set of chromosomes, XXY, that provide him with both male genitalia and feminine characteristics. As a result, Blank's partner has been mistaken for a gay woman, a straight man, a trans man, and their relationship has been classified as gay, straight, and everything in between. Phoebe Hart is a young, married Australian woman with male chromosomes and androgen insensitivity syndrome, AIS. That means her body doesn't respond to testosterone in a typical way. Her autobiography, Orchids, My Intersex Adventure, screened on ABC a couple of weeks ago. And it's also screened during queer film festivals, despite her being a straight woman. About half an hour into the movie, she asks her husband, James, how he felt when she told him she was intersex. He says, "Once I found out what AIS was, I was confronted with the fact that I thought I might be gay myself. Genetically, you're a male, but I think you can fall in love with a person. Whether that person is male or female doesn't really matter." As a side note, I had a similar discussion just post-diagnosis with my then long-term male partner, and the outcome was quite different. But back to Phoebe. Phoebe had internal testicles that produced testosterone. They were removed in adolescence due to a slight risk of cancer. What Phoebe doesn't say in her movie is that the risk is less than the risk of cancer that you get from having breasts. So why aren't breasts routinely removed? The reason is that women are not supposed to have testicles. But bodies need sex hormones to mature, to maintain a libido, to prevent osteoporosis and other reasons. Phoebe, like probably a majority of intersex people, is now on a lifelong course of hormone replacement therapy, with all the risks associated with that. Why does this happen? Why is this medicalization? It goes back centuries, and for most of that time, there was no clear differentiation between LGBT and I. Michel Foucault presented the case of Herculine Barbin in 19th century France, and Mogul, Ritchie and Whitlock, authors of a very useful book I can give you the reference of later, reports that as late as 1921, medical journals containing articles declared that a physical examination of female homosexuals will in practically every instance disclose an abnormally prominent clitoris, and that this is particularly so in coloured women. Intersex people have been part of the LGBT community all along, even if you weren't really aware of that. A key change happened in the 50s when New Zealand doctor John Money declared that sex equals nurture, not nature, and that the brain is an object for behavioural engineering. His now discredited work led to standard medical protocols that still result in cosmetic genital surgery on infants and children with intersex variations. Even now in Australia, these are performed to prevent social and familial discomfort, despite ample medical research that shows poor satisfaction and poor outcomes. The trauma associated with these surgeries led to the establishment of the first intersex movement, initially through a magazine ad and later online. The immediate priority was to engage with the medical profession. And in 2006, this led to a consensus statement that changed the terminology associated with intersex. It introduced the term disorders of sex development, or DSD. The aim of doing that was to create a non-pejorative, value-neutral term to replace intersex and hermaphrodite. In a very literal sense, it was homophobic. It aimed to eliminate a parental and social fear of homosexuality and gender ambiguity and queerness in an attempt to improve patient outcomes. And in doing that, it failed. Right now, in 2011-12, there are doctors working with a rationale for early surgery on infants that include minimizing family concern and distress and mitigating the risks of stigmatization and gender identity confusion. There is an intersex variation called CAH, congenital adrenal hyperplasia, that's a salt wasting condition requiring lifelong treatment. In women, it's also associated with higher levels of prenatal testosterone and a degree of masculinization. And doctors currently, in 2008, there was some research published that said that most women with this condition were heterosexual, but the rates of bisexual and homosexual orientation were increased above controls and correlated with the degree of prenatal androgenization. In 2010, US pediatric endocrinologists Maria New and Saroy Nimkhan from New York colleges describe constructing low interest in babies and men and even interest in what they consider to be men's occupations and games as abnormal and potentially preventable with prenatal dexamethasone. Dexamethasone is a class C steroid that in tests on sheep has been shown to reduce mental capacity. It also reduces birth weight and leads to other physical impacts. And Dr. Maria New in New York has begun clinical trials on pregnant human mothers to reduce masculinization in CAH girls. Dexamethasone also has no impact on salt wasting, so those children will still have lifelong medical needs. At OII Australia, we're also aware that amniocentesis is now possible to determine whether a child has a DSD like CAH, and preliminary research shows a drop in the number of live births with those intersex variations. So these show where you try to shift the medical system by changing the language. Calling something a disorder doesn't change medical protocols. The shift toward DSD destroyed the intersex movement at the time, and we've begun again from scratch. I think what happened with DSDs shows the rest of the LGBT movement is what happens when a group of disordered people are found to be born this way. And it's still the case that being trans is a disorder. For most people, being gay or lesbian is no longer a disorder, but it depends on which country you're in and on what religious viewpoint you have. So the intersex movement, the big weakness of the early movement was a failure to organize around the cause of medical treatment, around homophobia and misogyny. And what we're trying to do now is focus on the underlying causes and look at human rights and the ethical case for our liberation. So we're aligned with LGBT because of the nature of our oppression, which is homophobia. And that's why we're here today. So thank you.
So my next invitation is to Aram Hosie, who is Director of Research and Policy at the Inspire Foundation.
And also very short, so I'm going to stand over here so you can see me. And not very sick, but a little bit sick. So you'll have to excuse me if I cough and splutter a bit. I thought I'd give just a really quick intro to me because I'm not from around here. I'm from Western Australia. I spent half my life, half the year here, living and working, but usually I'm over there. And whilst I am certainly the Director of Research and Policy with Inspire, that's not really my activism role. I was the founding president of the WA Gender Project, and it's so more around kind of trans issues that most of my activism is related. I've been doing activism around LGBTI issues for over a decade. Initially involved in the gay and lesbian law reform in Western Australia in 2001, and then after coming out as a trans guy a bit over 6 years ago, discovered I had far less rights as a queer trans man than I did as a lesbian, and became very interested in what we could do to advance the rights of trans people. In thinking about what I would say today, I thought about what the kind of the loose theme of this conference was around how can we take the next leap in rights, and being a bit of a policy wonk, as you would have got from my job title, thought a leap is also what we describe as being a policy window, the kind of the opportunity that presents where you can introduce something new and make progress. Some political scientists are of the view that policy windows open randomly, you don't have much control over it, and what you need to do is be organised and prepared to seize on the opportunity when it arises. I'm not so sure about that. I reckon we can make our own luck, and that there's things you can do to create policy windows to open. And so thinking about where trans rights are at the moment, I think that there maybe is a window that's cracked open a little bit. We're moving into a space where there is the opportunity for us to take the next kind of leap, and it's as a result of lots of really hard work. My optimism comes from looking at the history of gay and lesbian rights. So if you go back 30 odd years, maybe a little bit more, there was a time when very few gay and lesbian people were out. People had really stigmatised and stereotypical views of gay and lesbian people. Didn't know gay and lesbian people, and gay and lesbian people didn't have rights. And of course, for a while, we were also deemed to be medically disordered. Then what happened is a few brave souls started coming out and being open about their sexuality, creating visibility around the issues and what was existing. Suddenly, straight people started knowing gay and lesbian people. They lived next door to one, or their brother was one. And with that increased visibility came better understanding, became awareness of the issues, and there started to be some of the breaking down of some of those really bad views that existed. From that then, a movement built, allies got on board, and we know, the rest is history. We're not quite there yet with gay and lesbian rights. Certainly in Australia we're doing well, other parts of the country, other parts of the world, they've got a long way to go, but everything is certainly progressing in the right direction. Now I think for trans people, we're about 30 years behind. So it's only more recently that trans people have started coming out. I think in the last little while here in New South Wales, you've had people like Nori and Conor Montgomery being out and in the media and talking about their experiences. In Western Australia, I was on the front page of the West Australian. We are a one newspaper town, so everybody saw that. You've had people like Chaz Bono, so you're starting, and Thomas Beattie, you're starting to get people coming out and talking about their experiences. As a result, that's increasing visibility. Suddenly people are starting to know a trans guy or a trans woman and have some understanding of the fact that we exist. We've always existed, you just haven't known. And also kind of what some of those issues are. At the same time now, I'm hearing trans and intersex being mentioned a lot more. Sometimes it's a bit tokenistic. I hear organisations call themselves LGBTI, but they're all about the L and G. But as this conference is a good example, people are increasingly trying to find a way to become informed and to progress those issues. Here in Australia, there's also then, I think that's resulted in some really good development. So I believe earlier, Commissioner Broderick was talking about the Sex Files report. That was a really important piece of work done by the Human Rights Commission, which began to open up the conversation here in Australia. We've had, I think as an important tool, when you don't have a huge movement of thousands of people, trans activists have been pushing through courts and through inquiries and through some of the formal systems we've got progress. So we've had High Court challenges, we've had appeals to administrative tribunals, And we've had some policy changes. So the Australian passport policy now is really, really good. And not very many people know the story about how that came about. I had the opportunity to speak to Kevin Rudd when he was still Foreign Minister about how that happened. And he said that the genesis for him was as a local member, he had some trans women who were his local constituents come and talk to him about the problems they had with passports. And he was genuinely interested as Foreign Minister in what the opportunities in his portfolio were to make changes. So those personal stories motivated him. He then asked his kind of minions, his advisors and the people in the department to look into it. They then started looking into it. There was a very small group of activists that they got together to give them some advice. Amazingly, they listened to exactly what they were told. And from that, we got really excellent passport policy out of that. So there's all these little things and this momentum that is growing. And so it gives me real optimism that, as I said, I'm not sure the window's wide open and we're going to have kind of all trans rights now, but I think there is a really good opportunity. At the same time, though, I don't think that's without challenge. So one of the things that concerns me is that the majority of the energy, it appears to me, in the LGBTI movement is focused on marriage equality. And I completely support marriage equality and I understand its importance. But I worry that it doesn't allow the space in the overall kind of consciousness and energy to talk about any of the other issues. And I worry that there's a little bit of this sense that once we've done that, we're kind of done. Many people understand that that's not the case, but there is a little bit of that. And certainly in the public too, I worry that they go, well, once we have got marriage, you're done now. And I think kind of back in Stonewall days, it was the trans women wielding their stilettos that started off some of the fight for rights. And I worry that whereas trans people have been working with gay and lesbian people all the way through to push rights, that we're going to, at the end of it, be left with a whole bunch of things that are undone and maybe not the momentum and the support to do that. The other big challenge that I think exists is in terms of trans people ourselves. We have to take as much responsibility as we can for ourselves to push our own agendas, but there's not that many trans activists around. Being out as a trans person can be quite challenging. If you come out as a trans person, you cannot really go back in, and it's not always an empowering thing. So the pool of activists is quite small, and our access to capital and to resources is not really good. I think the gay and lesbian rights movement's been really good at making progress, in part because there's been a big pool of people, access to lots of allies, and access to the resources to make things happen. Trans people just don't have the ability to mobilise those kinds of resources. So our ability to be at all the important conferences, to run campaigns, to do all that kind of stuff is really limited. And our ability to drum that up from anywhere else is quite limited. So a big challenge for us is for the people who are activists to not get burnt out and to find ways to keep kind of momentum rolling when there's not huge resources. But that's why I think allies is really important. So reflecting on what Morgan said, whether you are lesbian, gay, bi, trans or intersex, I think the commonalities in terms of the challenges we face are greater than our differences. And so the real way that we can get things done is by organising around those commonalities and helping each other out. So I'm really pleased that conferences like this make sure that trans and intersex voices are heard, and I strongly hope that continues to be the case and we can continue to work together, because I think from that is how we'll be able to make more progress. Thank you.
So now I'll invite the second last panellist, Sujay Kentlyn from the National LGBTI Health Alliance.
We happy band of select few. Thanks all for being here. I think I need to start maybe by giving you a little bit of background about me. I was a pastor's wife for 20 odd years, heterosexual, kids, the whole deal. Went to university, started studying feminist theory, became a lesbian. Yes, folks, it happens. Having been a lesbian for a while, began to grapple with my gender issues and eventually realised that I was genderqueer, which is a relatively new identity and not well understood. And so my PhD is aimed at remedying that problem. So that's where I am at in the spectrum. We don't have a letter in the alphabet soup, and that's probably just as well. So thinking about trans people in particular and human rights, the Yogyakarta Principles, you may know, is the application of international human rights law to sexual orientation and gender identity. And again, it leaves sex out, so too bad for the intersex folks. Principle 17, the right to the highest attainable standard of health. And so I just want to talk a little bit about health issues for trans people in that human rights context. So trans people need medical care that is informed, affordable, accessible, and equitable. In terms of informed, so trans people usually need to be treated by GPs, possibly endocrinologists, psychiatrists, psychologists, nurses, surgeons, pharmacists, speech pathologists, who should be adequately trained in trans health. At the moment, none of them are. To give you an example, there was a single psychiatrist in southeast Queensland who treated trans kids, and he became so overwhelmed with patients that he has closed his books. Where do they go now? So the issue of having medical staff who are trained and understand trans issues is a major one. A dear friend of mine was having a bilateral mastectomy at a hospital in Brisbane, which is government funded but run by a faith-based organisation. And the surgeon said to him, in my presence, "You will never have a male chest." Just complete no understanding of the impact of things like that on trans people. So the first one is informed medical care. The next is affordable. And as Aram was saying, you know, trans people often don't have access to resources. They often have insecure attachment to the labour market, as well as a history of relationship breakdown, mental health problems, homelessness, etc. It's not unusual for a trans person to lose their family, to lose their career, to lose their home, to go right back to square one. And you won't find them clustered in high-paying occupations. So, for example, in Queensland, because that's where I've just come from, I don't know the situation in New South Wales, there are a number of gender centres, but not properly funded by the Queensland Department of Health. So in Brisbane, they make some space available and they make access to the government psychiatrist available, but the service is actually run by a volunteer GP with admin help from a trans organisation. So when the volunteer GP got sick, they just couldn't take any more clients. Added to which the psychiatrist knew absolutely nothing about genderqueer. And so I spent 18 months going through that process, educating him about genderqueer before I could get a diagnosis, and I have to pathologise myself in order to get top surgery. In that process, he wanted me to seek a second opinion. Who knew that a private psychiatrist was going to cost $160 an hour? Which is just right out of reach for very, very many trans people. In all of the states of Australia, except possibly WA now, you have to have enforced sterilisation surgery to get your sex changed on your birth certificate. That's expensive, and a lot of people either have medical conditions that mean they can't have the surgery, they can't afford the surgery, or they simply don't want the surgery. So affordable medical treatment as well as informed medical treatment. Accessible. Medical practitioners with trans expertise are usually concentrated in major population centres, so that's a major issue for people in remote, rural and regional areas who, you know, usually have to come to the big cities for their treatments. The lack of proper government support for health services means that they are woefully inadequate to meet the need. Again, Queensland, because that's what I know, the gender clinic on the Sunshine Coast closed down altogether. The one in Brisbane wasn't accepting any new clients for like 12 months, and now they're accepting a limited number. The gender clinic on the Gold Coast isn't accepting new clients. And this at a time when people are wanting to transition in record numbers. So there just isn't accessible medical care for trans people. And finally, equitable. So, state legislation requiring surgery before registering a change of sex, you know, some people can't afford it, some have medical conditions, some don't want to. Why should they have to submit to risky and unnecessary surgery to have their gender recognised? Why is there this absolute horror of the idea of a male-bodied person having a baby? It's very atavistic, isn't it? It's very gut, and it's not rational, and we need to interrogate that. There's also issues around access to testosterone-blocking hormones through the pharmaceutical benefit scheme. There's problems with Medicare items. So Medicare items are gendered, which means that if you're legally female, you can't get a Medicare-funded prostate check. Is that right, Aram? Yeah. So there's a whole bunch of equity of access issues for trans people as well. And all of these things, quite apart from, you know, whether there are lots of trans people or only a few trans people, it is a fundamental human right, the right to the highest attainable standard of health. And on that basis, trans health is a real priority issue for us. Thanks.
So the last speaker I will invite up is Senthorun, who is the policy coordinator for the Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby in New South Wales.
Hey everyone, thank you for sticking around today as well. So we've heard some amazing speeches, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners on the land on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respect to their elders, both past and present. Now, the reason I begin with an acknowledgement of country, aside from it being a sign of respect and a formal process, is to acknowledge the ways in which activism in the community is fundamentally indebted to other kinds of activism. As we've heard, you know, the kind of push around gay and lesbian rights has owed such a great debt to the push of women's rights and the push to challenge norms around gender, the push around the recognition of racial minorities, the push around eliminating hierarchies based on wealth, or status or birth. And here in Australia we see as well, you know, we talk about the LGBTI communities, as Morgan rightly pointed out, we're not just one community, we're many communities. And certainly in the work that the lobby does is we acknowledge the fact that people aren't just gay or lesbian. You know, people come from all kinds of backgrounds. People could be asylum seekers or refugees. People could be from different cultural backgrounds. They could be of a particular aging group, whether they're young people or people seeking aged care services. They could be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the point is that when we talk about where we want to see ourselves move in a policy direction, we have to talk about how we fit into a rubric of society, and that a rubric is all about intersectionality. And one of the main policy areas that I and the lobby have been working on over the past year, in addition to the work on marriage equality, has been on the consolidation of the federal anti-discrimination laws. So currently, Australia has federal anti-discrimination laws that prescribe discrimination on the basis of sex, race, age, and disability. And there are some protections under industrial laws under the Fair Work Act. Now, there's obviously a notable exception to issues around, obviously, sexual orientation, gender identity, intersex. And one of the big kind of reforms to be led, thankfully, by the government and the Attorney General's Office in particular, has been around the consolidation project as part of the National Human Rights Action Plan. Basically, this project is about strengthening anti-discrimination laws by consolidating them and unifying them in a way that they're as broad and as cohesive as possible. And we've certainly been pushing for this idea of intersectionality to be included as part of that, in addition to the listing of protections. And thankfully, that's something we've really seen that the department has taken up and the government is really keen on. Just to put it in a little bit of context, Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a African-American female academic in the US, legal academic, in 1989 wrote about intersectionality when she was responding to anti-discrimination laws and arguing that the need to categorize your discrimination as either gender or sex or race was extremely problematic, and from her analysis on African-American women who were positioned in a very unique kind of double bind, if you like, under the way anti-discrimination law operates. Now, that was the year I was born, and thankfully now we've moved, 23 years on, and we finally caught up to where the academic thinking was back then, certainly in the US. And we've now seen a push at the government level to recognise that, it's really inadequate to have anti-discrimination laws where, you're discriminated against on the basis of multiple things. I mean, I think we can all safely say that, when we experience homophobia, we don't just experience homophobia, we experience possibly, racialized forms of homophobia. I mean, certainly from my experience, I'm never just a poofter, I'm a curry-munching poofter while I'm at it. So, I think it's, I find that amusing, but obviously it speaks to a much more troubling kind of context that we work in where, it's not just about one difference, it's about isolating as many differences as people can see, whether they're conscious of it or not. I think that's the other thing. A lot of people sometimes really unconscious of the fact that, we experience multiple and intersectional forms of discrimination. So I think just in terms of where we're headed as a country, in terms of obviously the major reforms that need to happen around marriage equality, but also recognising that the struggles are never really over for LGBTI people, precisely because we're in many communities. We belong to lots of different, faiths, religions, cultural groups, geographic contexts, and we have a lot of disparate and similar concerns. And I think it's really important that as we progress, we really do take in account of that and really build a movement that places diversity at its centre. And so I hope that a lot of people will, take that on and take that on in their own activism, in their own work that they do, and hopefully we'll see some kind of positive change in the near future. Thank you.
So, with the absence of Liz Price as a representative from Amnesty, I will be very brief and discuss a little bit about human rights activism. I'm very conscious of the fact of Boris Dietrich being in the audience, so I will do my best here. Human rights is my passion. I'm doing a law degree principally so that I can get into the international human rights framework. It is a fact of the international system that while you can get into international human rights advocacy without a law degree, it will probably take twice as long to do so. To talk about human rights, you almost always have to be able to speak legal language. To talk to people about rights, you have to speak to them with a legal language. So there are two approaches to human rights. There is the legal advocacy approach, which are taken by people who are in the international field like Boris Dietrich, but they are always supported by the activists on the ground. And to give you a really good example of the difference between those two is the issue of marriage equality and what that means as a human right. Yes, internationally, there is a human right for people to be able to be married. It's agreed almost universally by every participant in the United Nations. However, the convention is that states are allowed to define what marriage is. That means here in Australia, as long as the state defines marriage as between one man and one woman, the state not giving marriage equality means that is not officially a breach of human rights. That's the legal perspective. As activists, we have a political objection to that, and we have a political position that we take in indifference to that. So how do we work together? That is why both the advocates must speak to and engage with the activists. Often they are sometimes the same person, but you will have to use a different rhetoric and a different language when you're speaking to state actors as you would to be speaking to the people on the ground. To give you another example, sexuality, and well, specifically sexual orientation, and I realise that's a problematic term, is the word we use to describe GLB issues in international circles. It was first recognised in 1994 by a ruling of the Human Rights Council in an issue known as Tunin versus Australia. Some of you may remember that, as that was quite topical here. And the reason it was brought up and the reason it was able to be challenged was not because of discrimination, but because it was considered a violation of privacy. And so that was the ingress into being able to create a stage for sexual orientation internationally. And the only reason that it succeeded was because the council was able to determine that the term sex, which was very well understood, even though it's contestable, could include sexual orientation. Now, obviously, for the people here in that audience, conflating sex with sexual orientation is exceptionally problematic. They're two distinct issues, even though there is a large overlap. Another way that there is another way to understand this problem is recently in Malawi, there was a very public outroar around issues relating to a same-sex couple. However, upon some closer investigation, this is not confirmed, but there was some indication that one of those persons was in fact intersex, and so wouldn't have been understood to be a same-sex couple as we might engage with it. Yet, talking about them as a same-sex couple had a lot more international currency than talking about them as a couple with an intersex person. So this is an example of how we talk about these issues to state actors who are ultimately the ones that are going to be legislating in the international arena. Language remains the barrier. Even within English, we often have trouble defining these issues. So how do we breach that barrier when we're talking about not just differences in European languages, but differences with Asian languages, with African languages, the issues around the fact that the international language are colonial languages. So of course when you're saying we want LGBT rights or rights for sexual orientation and you're saying it in English, that helps reinforce this idea that it's a colonial paradigm that you're imposing upon third world states, or developing nations I should say. However, we still deal with those issues locally. One of the things that is problematic here for Australia is queer refugees, and there is very little recognition for those issues here. Often the tribunals, there is no professional status for the tribunals, they're appointed positions, and they can be positions appointed from a political favour, a cushy retirement, and there's no requirement that those people have any comprehensive understanding of what these issues mean for these people. And so they will ask, during the tribunal, they'll go, so how many people have you slept with? How long was your longest relationship? So in one chance, they're trying to say, well, are you promiscuous? Because we understand that to be a characteristic of gay people. Or how long was your longest relationship with a person of the same sex? And obviously it can be somewhat mutually exclusive, but they will be willing to disqualify and exclude people on either of those bases. They will ask, are you a fan of Madonna? Do you like Greco-Roman wrestling? Have you ever been to Oxford Street? So all these very cultural paradigms that are just completely inappropriate to be asking a refugee. Not only that, you're talking about where there was a couple that came across, and on the form they said, are you married? And they being a same-sex men couple who had been in a long-term relationship, as they understood, yes, they were married. But same-sex marriage is not recognised here in Australia, so as far as the tribunal was concerned, they were clearly heterosexual and were just trying to get in based on a false claim of homosexuality. Now, there's a lot more that I could go on about this, but I am conscious of time. I wish to just sort of flag some of those key issues and how we can think about it. What can we do on the ground? We can put pressure upon our local groups, our local parliamentarians, have conversations, engage with other people and give support to those who are actually acting on the international arena on our behalves. Ultimately, these questions talk to a very, very fundamental question of what is it to be human? Because if human rights are an a priori right, meaning you have these rights because you are human, then the question is begged, what does it mean to be human? And sometimes we're tempted to go to the question, to the answer, well, I was born this way, or this is innate, or this is in my genes. And I find that can sometimes be an unsatisfactory answer, because then you start getting people talking about cures. And a really useful way to understand how we can engage with this is through the politics of social models of disability. It's not important how you're born. It's not important where your difference comes from. It is important to induce change at the societal level to accommodate that difference, regardless of its origin. So with that, I will conclude, and I'd like to invite our panelists to come up and subject themselves to questions from the audience. And once again, I prefer questions first and foremost from the floor, but I have a list of questions in case you run out. Oh, don't make me.
Inspiring.
Don't make me have to give the first question.
I might do a Malcolm Turnbull and ask a question and then answer it. As he so well does at press conferences.
Or would you like to write it down? I can ask you the door.
Okay. It's far more obvious if I do it this way. I think Aram raised a good point in his speech, and it's something that I grapple with all the time about, is marriage equality consuming too much space in the wider issue of GLBTI rights and awareness? And it is something that is challenging. I guess there's two parts to that. One is in terms of the media and the press. Yes, they will write one gay story, and at the moment that gay story is about marriage equality. And of course it would be good if they were able to broaden it, and I think we can definitely work on doing that. The other point is, can politicians deal with more than one issue at a time? And from spending time in Canberra, I can assure you that they would love to talk about things other than marriage equality as well. So I think there is certainly space there. But yes, I am aware that the issue does have a public profile. I think that's because there's a parliamentary vote happening. I think it's because it's considered to be a sexy issue. But I think that there are some things that we've done quite successfully, and I think there's probably some good models and methods. I'm always happy to share any resources, information, contacts with anyone if it can help them in any cause or any way, and so we'll continue to do that. But I think I think everybody has spoken with a great deal of hope, and I think we all have hope because we do live in a thriving democracy. Anybody can go and meet with an MP or a series of MPs down in Canberra and put your case forward. We're fortunate that we have lots of friends across the table in Parliament. So I think although we do tend to dominate the issue, the general issue, we don't try to do it on purpose. It just happens there sometimes. But always happy to share resources and help anyone in any way that we can.
Can I make a comment on that? The trans community really needs to thank you for making equal marriage so prominent, because Warren Entsch has become a fantastic advocate for trans and intersex rights, because he doesn't want to talk about marriage.
That's exactly right.
So we can make it work for us.
Yeah,
it's not
exactly.
a problem.
Exactly.
And yeah, just to bounce off Sujay and Alex's point as well, I mean, I think the same can be said at the Attorney General's office as well. I mean, they're really happy to be, claiming credit and spearheading the human rights framework and the anti-discrimination law consolidation project, because it's something else aside from marriage equality, and something that, something we got. It also has broad support. I mean, the coalition also commit to, anti-discrimination laws to some extent. When you start bringing in religious exemptions, then it starts to be a lot more kind of a colourful debate. But I absolutely do think that, yes, you know, marriage does take up a lot of media interest, but at the same time, I think it also opens up opportunities to talk about a whole range of other issues. I mean, certainly I talk about marriage a lot as well and write about it a lot, but I also have been fortunate enough to write about the things like asylum seekers who are gay or lesbian or same-sex attracted that face persecution and seek asylum here, and also the situation in Uganda. And I've been fortunate that the mainstream News Limited press has been willing to run with that. So, you know, I do think there is opportunities to open up other conversations that relate to, I think the point is, you know, you talk about marriage equality, yeah, that's a specific issue, but underlying that is this challenging a homophobia, right? And so, or transphobia or some kind of prejudice. So then, I mean, it was really easy to then say, well, how about we can talk about Uganda, because, you know, we have the Christian lobby here talking about family values and cohesion, and then we have all these right-wing evangelicals going over to Uganda saying the same thing, and, you know, producing legislation that is effectively going to produce the genocide of a particular community. And we condemn them, but we don't condemn them here. But they're saying the same thing. I mean, obviously I'm not saying that we're going to get, you know, kill the gays bill here in Australia, thankfully. But at the same time, the underlying homophobia that is all about the cohesion of the family, you know, what about the children, all that kind of stuff. The rhetoric is the same. Why are we tolerating it here when we condemn the people in Uganda for saying the same thing? And so for me, that's been a really good opportunity, because, you know, we shouldn't think about conversations or campaigns in isolation. We should think about how they facilitate broader dialogues and conversations in a range of different ways as well.
So just quickly, because I know Alex will have to depart very shortly. So half a year from now, marriage equality is put to the Parliament. It succeeds. We have marriage equality here in Australia. Where to next? For the whole panel, but I'll let Alex respond first.
Well, if that happens, I'm going to take a break for a little bit. So I'll just put that out there. But we have so many other battles to fight on so many different fronts, and they all go, I think, to issues of acceptance and awareness. You know, there are issues, the ones that we've addressed today, but then also there's the, you know, I'm in a committed monogamous relationship, and I'm not allowed to donate blood because I'm gay. There's still the gay panic laws, and I know there's stuff that's happening on that. So there's so many other battles and so many other challenges, and we also have to remember that the enemy is not going away. And if we do get marriage equality in 6 months, there's going to be a legal challenge, and they're going to look at all sorts of other ways to get us. So it's a matter of, I think, always staying strong, being aware, and fighting all the battles as they come up.
Before you go on holiday, you can hand over the list of contacts.
Absolutely, I will. Absolutely.
Well then, Alex, would you like to take your departure at that
Thank you,
point?
everyone. Sorry.
Okay, I'll ask that question for the rest of the panellists. Marriage equality is one. It may have more or less relevance to you and your constituencies, but where should we go to as a community or communities next?
I think it's really hard to kind of prioritise, because there's obviously a range of issues that exist to kind of go, well then this is the next one we should look at. And I think marriage has taken up lots of consciousness because it affects lots of people and everyone understands it. It's pretty easy to get your head around the idea of being able to get married or not get married. I think some of the other issues, you know, things that Sujay talks about around access to medications under the PBS is kind of a bit obscure and difficult for people to mobilise around. The discrimination protection for me feels like a really big one that has an impact on many people's lives, and one that people can conceptually understand. So if we haven't gotten the discrimination stuff sorted out before marriages, that would need to be a very high priority. But then I think there's so many other issues after that that are all a little bit interrelated. I probably wouldn't see the same kind of massive campaign we get around marriage, but they all need to be worked through.
Can I just follow on from what Aram was saying? And also the understanding that we are not a community, we are a community of communities. And our various communities are going to have different priorities. For example, for intersex people, of course, they're going to prioritise intersex issues. But as a trans person, I very much want to be their ally and support them in that. And so that I hope that our communities could learn how to do strategic alliances which acknowledge that we do have different interests. We're not all singing from the same hymn sheet, but we can be really good allies for each other in whatever the next battle turns out to be.
I think the intersex movement is at the beginning of it's almost on the first step of a ladder, really. So it's quite hard to see. It's not a linear process either, fortunately, but we're actually trying to do a number of different things in parallel. And some of those things are common to other communities as well, particularly the trans community, but also the wider lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans community. But back on the issue of relationships, I mean, I'd like to see, once marriage becomes legal, that we start to think about how to value and validate other forms of relationship that aren't focused on marriage.
And just following from that, I think what's really interesting is when you trace the history of reforms around and relationship recognition and kind of the evolution of marriage, if you want to use that as your example, you'll see that actually, once a piece of reform has happened, you had Loving in Virginia in the US, which kind of removed the prohibition on interracial marriages. Then you started having, people then started taking up much broader conversations, because then it became, well, if having children that are the same race is not the key factor in marriage or indeed a relationship, then what is? And so I think as a result of the kind of changes, and I think this is certainly, I mean, obviously I don't subscribe to that, we're going to marry our dogs argument that the Christian right always run. But at the same time, I do think it's important that we acknowledge that marriage is a dynamic institution, and in a way that's good because it's facilitated these broader conversations around relationships. I mean, we heard earlier this morning that numerous people have non-marital relationships. They have de facto relationships, or they cohabit, and various other things. So that I do think once we do get marriage equality, or certainly that is the hope. Certainly, if we look at history, we'd start having broader conversations about how we value other kinds of relationships, and I think that'll be an organic change, if you like, through legislative reform. Because I mean, legal justice and social justice, or legal change and social change, are different, but they are related.
So we could get the right to marry and then all decide you're not
Yeah, exactly. And certainly for me, it's like, I've had conversations with some people who are quite conservative and say, it's not, and they say to me, what will the quantitative outcome be? I'm like, it's not a quantitative debate. I'm not saying that, that thousands and thousands of couples that are going to rush to the kind of the registry offices and be like, I want my marriage license now. But it's about the choice, right? It's about eliminating discrimination. It's about challenging homophobia. And I think, ultimately that's what it is for me. I mean, I guess I do also have a personal investment in the idea of marriage. I mean, I do like to think that maybe one day it might happen. But at the same time, right now that's certainly not, I'm not in a committed monogamous relationship where I'm, desperately fighting for my right to be validated by the state, but I am certainly fighting for the ability for people to make that choice should they want to.
Yeah, Malcolm McPherson. If I can ask about the intersex and transgender conversation that I might have with people, in the course of my social or activism connections with thinking and possibly, hopefully, influential people, what would be the main points that you would want me to make? Probably to people who don't really have any visibility of intersex and transgender people.
I think, to my mind, what is common to both intersex and trans people is a need for autonomy over our own bodies. And for intersex people, that begins sometimes both, or look at amniocentesis, look at it even earlier. You know, in some ways, it sometimes feels like our issues with the medical system are mirror images of each other, but bodily autonomy is crucial to all of us.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It depends obviously what knowledge base you're coming off with the person. Just making sure that trans and intersex people issues are even raised, so that in conversations where we're talking about human rights, if someone insists on talking about gay and lesbian people, reminding them that that's not all there is in our movement is a good start. Challenging instances of transphobia and is intersex phobia an appropriate word? I don't know, but kind of people making assumptions, or the things that people say that clearly are driven from a place of ignorance or fear about sex differences or about gender differences, and challenging those. I think that's really important. I think that ad recently that created the big uproar around the drag queen and trans women and that whole campaign. And it was interesting that I found many a number of gay men defending that ad and saying the trans people were being overly sensitive and needed to calm down, basically. And I found that incredibly frustrating in terms of, it's so incredibly hard, could not these gay people just simply say, if trans people